on what basis do they have more books than 66? Now, usually, for example, when you argue with Muslims, for example, about the legitimacy of the Bible, you don't even mention the Catholic canon or the Orthodox canon. You
No,
just go
they
by
mention it.
these.
They actually mention it. They'll
Oh,
tell
they
you,
mention it, yeah.
yeah, which canon of the Bible should you follow? The Catholic,
Hmm.
73, or the Protestant, 66? So they bring it up because they're aware of it.
Okay. And the point they're making is that there is, because of the discrepancy in the canon.
Exactly.
Okay.
Their point is, you guys can't agree to the exact canon of Scripture, right?
Yeah.
That's their point. So what's the basis? Well, the basis is that if you look at church history, many, if not most, of the Christians read these extra books as authoritative and canonical.
Okay.
The few that did not read them as canonical wasn't because they denied their canonicity. It's because they were interacting with Jews. After the time of Christ, starting at the 2nd century onwards, the Jews rejected these books more so as a reaction towards the Christian use of these books, because these books were much later in time, meaning they were not as old as the other books, what are called the proto-canonical.
Right.
And so around the 2nd century, Rabbi Akiva had pronounced that these books should not be read. So when the Christians are interacting with the Jews, they would quote those books that the Jews accept, because if they quote these other writings, it wasn't authoritative for them. So they followed that line. However, before and during the time of Christ, there were Jews who accepted the larger canon. For example, the Jews who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. They, in their collection of writings, you will find the letter of Jeremiah, you will find Tobit, and you'll find Sirach, and you'll find them in Hebrew as well as in Aramaic. So they accepted a larger canon. They even had the first section of Enoch called the Book of Watchers. So they had a larger canon. And then if you look at the Greek versions of the Old Testament called the Septuagint and assume that these Greek versions accurately preserve the original Greek translations, because the Greek translation of the Old Testament was done by Jews, starting with the first 5 books of Moses. And that was produced around 280 years before the time of Christ. So if you follow this line and you do not suspect that the Greek versions of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, because the oldest copies that we have that are large, meaning has a more fuller collection of books, they're from the 4th century. Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Vaticanus, and there's some dispute. Codex Sinaiticus. And you assume that this larger collection reflects books that were originally translated by Jews, then that means the Hellenized Jews, the Alexandrian Jews, the Grecian Jews read these books as scripture.
Okay. So they saw them as authoritative in that regard. Okay. What would you say about that? Like, what is your position? I know you are in a journey yourself, but
I used to be Protestant, but I've changed my position. I accept these books. Martin Luther at one time accepted these books as scripture, but when these books were used against him, refuting his innovations, he then rejected them.
Okay. Because I'm a Protestant myself. Well, I used to attend a Catholic church in my early days, but I've been Protestant since. But I believe in Trinity, and I've been on a journey myself, and I've more so changed my position on how I view the Catholics and the Romans. But I still have some questions regarding that. But how were these scriptures used against Martin Luther specifically? Was it concerning his theology?
Yep. 2 Maccabees 12, 39, 46, where it says, praying for the dead and making sacrifices for the dead is taught in 2 Maccabees 12, 39 to 46.
Okay.
So these were the doctrines that threw a monkey wrench in his understanding.
Right. Okay.
When Judas Maccabees defeated the pagan army, the Syrian army, some of the Jewish soldiers were killed in battle. This is in 2 Maccabees 12, 39, 46. Now, some translations, it's 2 Maccabees 12, 39 to 45. Now, Judas was troubled. He's wondering, why did God allow these Jewish soldiers to be killed? So under their robe, they found an amulet. An amulet with the images of the gods of Jamnia. So these Jews were steeped in idolatry. They were syncretists. They were
Right.
worshiping God and the idols. So as punishment, God allowed them to be killed.
Hmm.
Now, Judas, seeing that, sent money to the priests, because now they had rededicated temple, to offer sacrifices for atonement, and they prayed for them, hoping that God would take their prayers and the sacrifices into consideration, so at the day of resurrection, these Jews would be forgiven.
I see.
But they're already dead. So why
Hmm.
are the Jews praying for the dead and offering sacrifices for the dead? That tells you that the Jews believed you could still pray for the dead to obtain mercy after their death.
Right. But is that based off the Bible, or is it based off their own Talmud, like the Babylonian or
There
something
was
else?
no Talmud at that time. This
They're
is
all right. That was written like 4th, 5th century, right?
so that
But
means
but
they're getting it from their Bible, right?
but they didn't have other oral traditions apart from the Bible before the Talmud
Even
was
if you
compiled.
say oral traditions,
Mm-hmm.
this is a practice that is not condemned, because
Mm-hmm.
even the book says that he did
Mm-hmm.
something noble. It was noble that he
Noble.
did this. So that tells you that the author of Second Maccabees praised this act of Judas, and it's something that didn't shock the Jews, which means it was common, because it was something new and shocking. We would expect a negative reaction, but we don't get any negative reaction. And besides,
Mm-hmm.
that begs the question, because that assumes Second Maccabees is not scripture. If it is scripture, then that means this is God approving this act and recording it in an inspired book.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
Martin Luther used that to deny its canonicity. But that's begging the question, because Martin Luther rejected books that he thought were not sound in doctrine based on his understanding of what sound doctrine was. He even
Right.
wanted to throw out James and Hebrews from the canon.
Well, that would have been blasphemous, I would say.
But that's what he wanted to do, because James did not agree with his doctrine of sola fide.
Right. The sola fide was by faith alone.
And James chapter 2 proved a nightmare for him. It's in his writing. He
Yeah.
says, because it's an epistle of straw, and he goes, that would he'd gladly give up his degree for anyone who can reconcile James with Paul. He said, you cannot reconcile them.
Hmm. Yeah, because it's written in James, you show me your faith, I'll show
But it's
you
not
my
only show
faith with
your
my
faith.
hands. Hmm.
James goes beyond saying, show me. It says James 2:14. He's
Mhm.
talking about faith that saves. He goes, if you have a faith that's not working, can such faith save him?
Right.
It's not than proving that you have faith. It's the faith that saves. And James says, a faith that is not working cannot save anyone.
No.
So he misinterpreted Paul. He butchered Paul, having
Mhm.
Paul teach sola fide. And he saw that his understanding sola fide is contradicted by James. So he took it as James contradicting Paul. He didn't contradict Paul. He contradicted Martin Luther's misinterpretation of Paul.
Huh.
So that's how it works.
So one could say that at the time of Martin Luther, he had good intentions, but then he kind of let it just get to his head.
Yeah,
Like,
he became his own pope, and he
yeah.
became his own magisterium, and he became his own authority. And if you disagree with him, then you were the heretic. Because
Mm.
he didn't only disagree with the Catholic Church, the reformers disagreed with one another and had heated debates among themselves.